What if the frustration you feel right now isn't a sign that something is wrong with your life, but proof that you're fighting the very direction meant to save you? You wake up with plans, strong ones. You tell yourself today will be different. You will decide. You will control the outcome. And for a moment, that illusion feels comforting. But by the end of the day, the same weight returns, the same restlessness, the same quiet disappointment you can't explain to anyone. It's not because you're weak. It's because deep down, you know you're pulling against something stronger than you. There is a tension living inside you. You feel it when things almost work but never fully settle, when success still feels empty, when progress doesn't bring peace. You've tried fixing the surface, new habits, new goals, new distractions. Yet something deeper remains unresolved. It's the struggle between what you want and what God is asking of you. And the longer you ignore it, the louder it becomes. You were taught that holiness means being flawless, untouched, separate. But that idea only made you tired. You tried harder. You failed quietly. You felt guilt instead of growth. So you backed away, convinced holiness wasn't for someone like you. That misunderstanding cost you years. Holiness was never about being perfect. It was about being aligned. And misalignment always drains the soul. The exhaustion you carry is not from effort. It's from resistance. Every time you insist on your own way, something inside you tightens. You defend choices you don't even enjoy anymore. You justify paths that no longer fit. You call it independence, but it feels more like isolation. Control promised safety, yet it delivered anxiety. And still, letting go feels terrifying because part of you believes surrender means losing yourself. That fear didn't come from nowhere. Your mind is wired to protect what feels familiar. Even pain can feel safer than uncertainty. So you cling to your will because at least it's yours. At least it's known. But safety and growth have never lived in the same place. And deep down you sense that holding on is costing you more than letting go ever could. Here is the truth no one says out loud. God's will is not the enemy of your freedom. Your will unchecked is. Every time you push ahead without Him, you carry the full weight alone. Every decision becomes a burden. Every outcome feels fragile. But when alignment happens, something shifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. The pressure eases, the noise quiets. You stop forcing doors that were never meant to open. You don't need more discipline. You don't need more knowledge. You need honesty. An honest look at where your way has led you. An honest admission that control hasn't delivered peace, that your strength has limits, that your plans, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot see what God sees. And here's the promise you've been waiting for. Even if you didn't know it, there is a way to live without this constant inner conflict. There is a version of obedience that doesn't crush you, but carries you. A form of holiness that doesn't shame you, but steadies you. It begins when you stop asking God to follow your plans and instead allow yourself to be led. Nothing changes on the outside until alignment happens on the inside. And once it does, life doesn't become easier, but it becomes lighter. Purpose replaces pressure. Trust replaces fear. And for the first time in a long time, you stop fighting the current and start moving with it. That sense of lightness you felt for a moment is not imagination. It's what happens when the soul stops resisting truth. But this is where most people retreat, because alignment demands a decision, not a feeling. And decisions expose what comfort has been hiding. You can feel peace knocking and still refuse to open the door. That hesitation is where everything is decided. God's will does not compete with your desires. It confronts them. It stands in front of the life you planned and asks whether you trust yourself more than Him. This is where the stakes rise, because delay feels harmless, but it slowly trains the heart to ignore conviction. Each time you postpone obedience, it gets quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because you've taught yourself not to listen. You already know the cost of that silence. It shows up as restlessness, as distraction, as a life that looks full but feels hollow. You stay busy to avoid facing the one thing that could change everything. Surrender, not the dramatic kind, the daily kind, the kind that happens when no one applauds and nothing immediately improves, the kind that strips excuses and exposes motives. This is where urgency lives, not in fear, but in clarity. Because every day you choose your own will over God's, you reinforce a pattern, and patterns become prisons when left unchecked. You don't wake up one day far from God. You drift there slowly, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, and drifting feels peaceful until you realize how far you've gone. Obedience feels heavy only before you practice it. After that, resistance becomes heavier. This is the paradox no one warns you about. Carrying your own will costs more energy than carrying God's. One demands constant defense. The other offers quiet strength. One needs control. The other grows through trust. And trust is not passive. It is an active refusal to live small. You were not created to negotiate with God. You were created to walk with Him. Negotiation keeps you divided. 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, always calculating, always protecting, always afraid that full surrender will take something you cannot afford to lose. But what if what you're afraid of losing is exactly what's keeping you stuck? There is a moment when clarity sharpens and excuses collapse. When you realize God isn't asking for perfection, only obedience. Not tomorrow, not when it makes sense. Now. Because partial surrender keeps you in constant tension. You pray for peace while choosing conflict. You ask for guidance while insisting on control. And then you wonder why nothing changes. Change begins when agreement ends, when you stop arguing internally and choose alignment outwardly. This is not about emotion. It's about direction. Your feelings will follow later. First comes the step. The decision to trust God more than your comfort, to value obedience more than approval, to believe that His will sees what your fear cannot. This is the line few are willing to cross. But those who do never forget what happens next, not ease, not instant answers, but grounding, stability, a sense that life is no longer random, that even struggle has meaning, that obedience builds something inside you that success never could. You don't need to fix your entire life today. You need to stop resisting the one thing God has already made clear. That resistance is costing you momentum. It's draining your focus. It's keeping you spiritually tired. Alignment restores strength because it removes friction. When will and purpose move together, power follows. This is not about becoming religious. It's about becoming whole, about ending the internal war that has quietly shaped your days. Holiness begins the moment you stop placing your will above God's. And once that choice is made, nothing stays the same. Not because life becomes easy, but because it finally becomes true. Truth has a way of pressing closer once you stop running from it. And now it's right here, asking for more than agreement. It's asking for movement, because knowing is not the same as obeying. Understanding is not transformation. Many stay stuck because they confuse conviction with completion. They feel stirred, inspired, almost changed, then return to the same patterns and call it patience. But delay is not wisdom. It's hesitation dressed up as caution. This is where the weight of choice settles in. God's will does not bend to your timeline. It waits, steady and unshaken, while you circle the same crossroads. Every time you choose comfort over obedience, the cost increases, not loudly, quietly. Your heart grows familiar with disobedience, not rebellious, just numb. And numbness is dangerous because it feels calm while slowly killing urgency. You were not meant to live half alive, yet partial surrender produces partial power. You feel moments of clarity, but they fade. Moments of peace, but they don't last. because alignment cannot be sampled. It must be chosen fully. Anything less keeps you suspended between who you are and who you were meant to become. God's will does not shout. It doesn't beg. It waits for courage. And courage is not loud confidence. It is quiet obedience when fear still lingers. The kind of obedience that costs you something real. Pride, control, familiar habits, the version of yourself that insists on staying in charge. That version feels strong, but it's tired, and it's been leading you in circles. The moment you stop defending your will, truth rushes in. You see clearly what you've been protecting and why. You see how much energy it took to maintain, and an image of strength while avoiding trust. You see how obedience was never about losing freedom, but about gaining direction. Without direction, even strength becomes wasted effort. This is the point where lives begin to change or quietly return to routine. There is no middle ground here, because once you see you are responsible, ignorance is gone, excuses lose their grip. The call is simple but costly. Lay down your way, not someday, not gradually. Delayed obedience trains the heart to negotiate, and negotiation always favors fear. God's will is not distant, it's present. In the decision you keep postponing, in the habit you know must end, in the step you sense but keep rationalizing away. Alignment doesn't arrive through emotion, it arrives through action. And action reshapes identity faster than inspiration ever could. When obedience begins, something shifts beneath the surface. Not relief, but resolve. Not answers, but assurance. You stop needing constant confirmation because direction becomes clear. Life doesn't slow down. Resistance does. The inner noise fades because your will is no longer arguing with purpose. Energy returns because friction is gone. You begin to understand holiness differently. Not as restriction, but as clarity. Not as distance from life, but depth within it. Holiness is not about avoiding the world. It's about walking through it with God instead of ahead of Him. And that difference changes everything. The longer you wait, the harder this choice feels. Not because God withdraws, but because habits strengthen. Comfort builds walls. Fear learns your patterns. But obedience weakens fear every time it's practiced. Each step aligned with God's why. LL builds momentum. Momentum builds confidence. Confidence builds faith. This is where action becomes unavoidable. Not dramatic gestures, simple obedience, saying yes where you've said no, letting go where you've clenched tightly, trusting that God sees what you cannot and leads where you would never go alone. Holiness begins here, not in perfection, but in alignment. And alignment begins the moment you finally choose God's will over your own. Once alignment begins, there is no turning back without consequence. You can't unsee truth. You can't unknow what obedience awakens. This is where life stops being casual, because every choice now carries weight. Not pressure from God, but responsibility within you. You are no longer unaware, you are awake, and awakening demands response. God's will doesn't remove struggle. It removes confusion. You stop asking why everything feels fractured. You see it clearly. Your will was pulling you one way, purpose another. And now that they are no longer at war, movement begins. Forward, not faster but steadier. Not louder but stronger. Strength that doesn't rely on emotion. Strength that holds even when feelings collapse. This is where many hesitate again. Because progress exposes what still needs to die. Old habits resist. Old identities fight for survival. The part of you that thrived on control feels threatened. And it should, because it was never meant to lead. God's will doesn't coexist with ego. One must yield. And yielding is not passive, it is decisive. You feel the urgency now because time matters. Every day lived misaligned shapes you, it trains you. Either toward trust or toward self-reliance. Neutral doesn't exist. Every small decision is casting a vote for the person you are becoming. And the future version of you is already forming based on what you choose right now. Obedience sharpens discernment. You start noticing what drains you and what builds you, what pulls you away and what pulls you deeper. You no longer need chaos to feel alive. You no longer confuse noise with purpose. Peace stops feeling boring and starts feeling powerful, because peace rooted in obedience cannot be shaken by circumstances. Holiness stops being an abstract idea. It becomes practical, tangible, visible in restraint, in patience, in humility, in saying no when ego wants applause, in saying yes when fear wants safety. This is where your life becomes a testimony without words, because alignment produces fruit quietly, consistently, unmistakably. You begin to understand why resistance felt so exhausting, why control kept you anxious, why independence left you isolated. You were never designed to carry life alone. God's will was not limiting you, it was supporting you. And now that support is active, not as ease, but as endurance. This is the moment where faith becomes embodied, not spoken, not quoted, lived. You walk differently, you choose differently, you respond instead of react. And people notice, not because you announce it, but because stability stands out in a restless world. Obedience gives you an anchor, and anchored people don't drift with every storm. The cost of obedience is real, but the cost of disobedience is greater. One costs comfort, the other costs purpose. One demands surrender, the other demands everything. You decide which price you are willing to pay, because payment is unavoidable. Life will ask, what? For something. The question is what you will offer. God's will does not require you to understand the entire path, only the next step. And clarity grows with movement. Direction sharpens with obedience. Strength multiplies with alignment. Waiting for certainty keeps you stuck. Walking by trust keeps you growing. This is not a call to perfection. It is a call to loyalty. Loyalty to truth over convenience. Loyalty to purpose over preference. Loyalty to God over self. And loyalty, once chosen, reshapes the soul. You don't need a sign, you need resolve. The resolve to stop living divided, to stop bargaining, to stop delaying what has already been made clear. Holiness is not an achievement you reach. It is a posture you choose, a daily decision to let God lead where you once insisted on control. This is where the journey becomes real, where belief turns into action, where alignment becomes identity. And once you choose God's will over your own, you don't just change direction, you change who you are becoming.